Dr. Stephen Gray is an associate professor in the Department of Community Sustainability at Michigan State University and a research associate in the Collective Intelligence Unit at the IT University of Copenhagen. His research focuses on socio-environmental modeling and understanding how individuals and groups make decisions about complex socio-ecological systems. His recent work is focused on developing computational approaches to harnessing, moderating, and integrating diverse knowledge systems to address complex problems. Currently, his lab is developing and maintaining a participatory modeling software called Mental Modeler, which he, his students, and colleagues are applying in a variety of environmental planning and research contexts, including marine spatial planning in Europe, co-created citizen science projects in the US and Australia, coastal hazard planning in the Pacific Islands, recreational angler decision-making in Germany, wildfire planning in the Pacific Northwest, conservation agricultural planning in Nepal and India, and understanding bushmeat trade practices and dynamics for conservation planning in Tanzania. To date, the Mental Modeler software has been used in over 200 academic papers in diverse fields, including engineering, education, social justice, and in human health. We'll be getting a look at this tool here today. Without further delay, I'll yield the floor. Stephen, please go ahead.
So it's really nice to be here with you guys today, and thanks to Hector and Dave. I've been talking with them over the last several months, finding out more about gene drives in general and GeneConvene in particular. And today I'm going to be talking about fuzzy cognitive mapping as one way to conceptualize complex problems, but really more as a way to integrate different knowledge systems to have a better understanding of how complex systems function, so that policy recommendations and stakeholder input can be included in those decisions. So a little bit of background about me. I'm an ecologist by training. And when I was a PhD student, how I ended up arriving at this idea of fuzzy cognitive mapping was not a linear one. I was interested as a PhD student in understanding issues associated with commercial fisheries and bycatch. And bycatch, for those of you who may not know, is just commercial fishermen catching fish that they cannot sell on the market. And so it's a huge problem for commercial fishermen because they don't want to have all of these fish they can't sell on the market. They have to sort them when they're on deck, so it takes away their time. Environmental groups obviously don't want fish that are not going to be utilized on the market to be caught and again killed. And managers are also concerned about managing this problem. So this is where really my interest in kind of collaborative decision making and knowledge integration started, was looking at bycatch in commercial fisheries. And at the time, this is off the coast of the US in the mid-Atlantic. You can see New Jersey here. Here's the Boston up here in Massachusetts. Down here is Delaware. We had two huge data sets that we were going to use to address this problem. Working with some fisheries biologists from NOAA and from some oceanographers from Rutgers University, we had a huge data set of the physical ocean and how it was changing in basically real time. So we had depth, sea surface temperature, chlorophyll, and this huge, wonderful data set that was dynamic and time-stamped and also spatially explicit. At the same time, we had a lot of NOAA information from their sampling surveys about what kind of fish were caught and where. And at the time, fisheries management in the mid-Atlantic was really concerned about the butterfish bycatch in the loligo squid fishery. Butterfish is this little guy up here you can see on the top. They were catching too many of these guys when they were fishing for squid. So what we did was we wanted to see, well, what is butterfish habitat and how can we tell commercial fishermen to avoid those areas? So we put these two big data sets together and come up with this very dynamic and interesting model that shows basically all the red area is where it's highly likely that it's butterfish habitat and butterfish might be there. So we wanted to tell commercial fishermen, hey, if you want to fish for loligo squid and not catch the butterfish in your nets, then avoid these areas of high probability of butterfish bycatch. And I'm not sure if you guys know how fishery management works in the United States, but there are several regional councils made up of different stakeholders that make decisions. Those can be seen in these different colored areas here. And I'm pretty sure you guys have not been to a fishery management meeting, but it's just as exciting as this looks. And it's a convening of a bunch of different stakeholders around commercial fisheries. You've got decision makers that represent different interests within the various fisheries. You've got commercial fishermen, seafood industry, recreational fishing, which is very different than commercial fishing. Sometimes they're at odds, environmental NGOs, and scientists. And they all come together to try to figure out how to best manage fisheries sustainably. So we came in knowing about this butterfish bycatch issue and said, guys, we have a solution for you. All you have to do is avoid the butterfish habitat based on our maps, and you can catch the loligo squid without putting the butterfish population at risk. This was met in the best sense with skepticism, and in the worst sense, outright contempt. They laughed at our maps. They said it was a resource assessment issue, not a bycatch issue, that the assessments were wrong. The maps, if you looked at the scale of it, are on a huge time and temporal scale, which is not at all match with the decision-making that a commercial fisherman does when he decides where to put his nets. And it really was ill-informed that they could use this product and actually address their decision-making problems. So this was my introduction to two things. One is this idea of a type 3 error. And a type 1 error is rejecting the null hypothesis when it's true, kind of exemplified, symbolized here. Type 2 error is accepting the null hypothesis when it's false, so getting a false negative. And a type 3 error was providing the right answer to the wrong question. We had these beautiful models that were really innovative at the time, but they were useless. We were trying to fit what we had done to a problem, and they were completely mismatched. This was also my introduction to this idea of wicked problems. And wicked problems are social or cultural problems that are difficult or impossible to solve for several reasons. They either have incomplete or contradictory knowledge. The number of people and opinions involved vary. Their large economic burden to understand how to actually address these things and get collaborative movement in one direction. And they're interconnected with other problems that are poorly understood. And a lot of this is all characterized under this broad umbrella of uncertainty related to how to move forward. So whereas the traditional problem has technological innovation, so you can think of a river going between two land masses and you want to get from one land mass to the other, you might just build a bridge. We have engineering solutions to that. But a wicked problem, much like many of the problems that I think GeneDrive and GeneConvene is meant to address, requires good scientific technological innovation, but also social innovation to see how those solutions can be accepted on the landscape and be informed by the cultural landscape in which they're deployed. So this got me interested at the time in this idea of collaborative modeling. How can we come together and turn this diversity of perspectives about an issue from a liability that kind of impedes progression into an asset? And can we use kind of culturally informed institute what is going on the ground, what's going on the ground at the time to inform the deployment of technological solutions? And so to put it another way, how can we kind of capitalize on great scientific knowledge that we have to address some problems, the issues that policymakers have expertise in, and the different community and stakeholders in which these things are going to be deployed? How could we put their different knowledge systems together to have a better understanding, reduce uncertainty, and also have stakeholder buy-in in a collaborative kind of way? So this got me interested in knowledge integration. And in my area of environmental science, climate change, overfishing, deforestation, these things are all going to take multiple people working together to combine their knowledge systems and different expertise to address these issues. And of course, these issues are not just limited. These complex issues we're dealing with environmental issues is not just, they have implications for understanding things like food security and even vaccination. And funnily enough, I made this slide like 4 years ago with the vaccination, of course, not anticipating the global pandemic. So we began working in this space with a lot of different people. This is a paper that came out to try to think about frameworks for how to integrate good scientific knowledge, technical innovation, but make sure that it's culturally relevant and informed. And the deployment of such, we can kind of understand what the impacts might be when these things are promoted for adoption. This was a working group led by Eleanor Sterling to try to come up with how different knowledge systems exist within these complex system spaces. And we came up with 3 different ways in which we can think about knowledge systems. In one sense, they can be completely independent. We have really good scientific knowledge that's generalized about how the world works in whatever domain. It could be genetics, it could be climate change. And then we also have culturally informed knowledge that's on the ground, that's sitting there. And these two can completely be separate and just revolving in their own sphere and not interacting with each other at all. Oftentimes, we see that it can be conflicted or rejected. When scientific knowledge, even the best science, is meant to be uptaken by society, there can be this huge disconnect. And of course, we need to look no further than the current vaccine debate to see how this happens. Not necessarily, so they could be completely in conflict. Or what we want is for these things to be integrated. So the local, cultural, political knowledge can be integrated with good scientific, rigorous scientific knowledge, and they can be synthesized together. Now, I realize that this is not anything that is earth-shattering. So yeah, sure, that's great. Of course, we want these things to be integrated, but the question is how. So around the same time, I started working on a computer software based in fuzzy cognitive mapping, the goal of which was to get multiple stakeholders in a room to model a problem so that our conceptualization of the problem and the dynamics can be informed by multiple perspectives to get a better model than any individual working alone. And I have a little video here to just show you the nature of what the software does. And this was developed years ago, just to get an idea of the approach we're using to deploy this software.
Welcome to Mental Modeler. I hear you. What is it? Mental Modeler is an easy-to-use, free, online systems modeling software that helps individuals and groups capture their knowledge about complex environmental or social problems to increase their decision-making power. Mental Modeler is based on fuzzy cognitive mapping, which is a form of concept mapping where users can develop qualitative static models that the software translates into semi-quantitative dynamic models that are useful for running what-if scenarios. With these scenarios, users can create models that are useful for determining possible outcomes of decisions, policies, or to predict system-level changes. Representing and sharing different people's ideas about a problem helps us understand assumptions, commonalities, and differences, which helps us capture the collective intelligence of groups and improve collaborative problem solving. Mental Modeler lets you build fuzzy cognitive maps easily and intuitively, and has been used in a variety of decision-making contexts ranging from understanding factors that influence cancer risk, to tsunami planning in the Pacific, to education. So how does it work? First, users define the components of the system or problem, which are things that increase or decrease in quantity or quality, like coffee and productivity at work. Second, users define the relationship between these components. Does coffee increase or decrease productivity? And by how much? The models can get complicated. But when these models are completed, you can run scenarios by increasing or decreasing components to see how the other components will react. It's that easy to see how a specific decision or change might impact all the other pieces it's connected to. It sounds complicated, but the great thing about Mental Modeler is that it's designed to be used by anyone through a very easy interface, and, even better, it is available online for free.
So we developed this tool, and I've been quite surprised about how many different contexts it can be applied to. Just me working with my colleagues in kind of collaborative modeling workshops in person. And of course, since COVID, we've moved to collaborative modeling online. We've been able to better understand issues related to ecosystem change in Canada, tsunami planning in the Pacific, oil safety culture in the Gulf, which is an interesting one because we have a lot of engineering solutions to promote safety, to reduce issues related to accidents, including oil spills in the Gulf. But that turns out to be a human problem. It's often a user error. It's not a technological error that causes a lot of these accidents. We looked at flooding in Boston, climate change in Ireland, bushmeat hunting in Tanzania. Perhaps most interesting to you guys, we're also looking at, or we have looked at, the promotion of conservation agriculture. So the technological innovation of conservation agriculture, and whether and how it can be adopted by farmers in Nepal and in India. And we've also looked at it related to drought management in Australia, among many, many others. And so this got me thinking and got me to a place to say, well, you know, this is working pretty well using fuzzy cognitive map. And I'll show you guys toward the end of this how to actually do this with a group of stakeholders. But it got me thinking more generally about the nature of modeling with stakeholders. And so several years ago, with some colleagues who I think you'll hear from later on in this seminar series in December, got together and started to synthesize different approaches related to modeling with stakeholders. And of course, we're focused on environmentally modeling with stakeholders, but this has huge implications for public health. And there's a lot of people working in that space as well. And one of the things we did was we said, well, what are the common areas about how we work with stakeholders to fact find, get some information about the nature of the problem, facilitate kind of a social process of figuring out you know, what the major pieces of the problem are, moving those over into qualitative conceptualization of the problem, running scenarios, look at cause and effect relationships, and then ultimately leading to, if the context is appropriate for it, moving into higher order modeling of agent-based modeling and things like Bayesian models and system dynamics. And there were several off-the-shelf tools that can be used, and they have different trade-offs when trying to understand the nature of these complexities, working in a participatory way with stakeholders. Qualitative approaches tend to be good for problem identification. How do we frame the nature of the problem? How do we identify cause and effect relationships? And this is meant to build some transparency and input from stakeholder into these processes. We have semi-quantitative approaches, of which my chosen approach, where mental modeler is based on, is fuzzy cognitive mapping. And these are good about data collection about the problem. What are the parameters? How do we bound the problem space? And other important information that can be used for problem structuring to ultimately use more higher order modeling approaches, such as agent-based modeling, where we can look at the emergent properties of the nature of the problem, or system dynamics modeling, where we can look at, well, maybe there are some externalities. What are the unintended consequences of pulling a policy lever or making a decision about how to deploy a certain technology that we might not have anticipated before? This is from a paper that came out in Environmental Modeling and Software that just shows, in general, what are the trade-offs? So we have this toolkit of collaborative modeling that can be shown here on the top. Are they good for, does the problem space need spatial representation? Does it need temporal resolution? How can we communicate the results of these models to stakeholders? As you can see with transparency, most of the lower order to mid order modeling techniques are pretty good. When you get to things like agent-based modeling, integrated modeling, the communication becomes a little bit harder. But this is just to give an idea, just to wrangle the field and kind of synthesize what's going on so that people can understand what is the best participatory modeling approach to use given the nature of the stakeholders you're working with and the nature of the problem that you're trying to address. And just to give you a little bit of background, I know this is tangential to you, but we're using these approaches to understand complex problems. In this particular case, this is a project that's going on for a couple of years now, looking at the Flint food system. Flint, Michigan is an economically depressed city in Michigan. And the food system is suboptimal, to say the least. There's not a lot of grocery stores. So we wanted to work with community to understand the complexity of this issue, using both scientific knowledge about how food systems work from food scientists and nutritionists and people working in that area, but also working with the community. And so we have adopted several different qualitative approaches, scenario planning, working with stakeholders. How did they understand the nature of the problem in the food system in Flint? What got them there? We even looked at linguistic analysis of white and black church cookbooks. Through this, we began to structure the nature of the problem of the food system using fuzzy cognitive maps in particular. And we're in this, and all of these things kind of inform each other in a process. But ultimately, we want to develop spatially explicit models, specifically system dynamic models and some agent-based models, to understand if we make a change in the food system, how can we steer it toward a more preferred state? But this idea of co-production and participatory processes, I just want to say, has been kind of heralded as this new paradigm, but I would say that it's actually normative for science these days. There's the approach of being informed for most scientific research these days needs to involve stakeholders, the people who are going to be affected by it, to kind of narrow the gap between scientific knowledge production and societal need, and also draw on the expertise of the stakeholders that might be affected by deployment of certain approaches. This is from a special issue in Nature that came out in 2018. And I think this was really like the point at which it became clear that this is the normative approach to science. This is no longer kind of a new thing. You can also see this in federal funding calls. This is Convergence Research at the National Science Foundation. And one thing that I think is particularly relevant to gene drive research is convergence is the emergence of new disciplines to some extent. Research driven by specific and compelling problems. Convergence research is generally inspired by the need to address a specific challenge or opportunities, but the process of how to do this with stakeholders, given really good, solid, basic science, is still not well understood. And so NSF in this regard was kind of calling for the need to understand the process of how new disciplines emerge and how science can be better integrated with stakeholder and societal need. So where do we go next? It's a good question. So with all of this information, I started to get into ideas about collective intelligence. How can we, again, harness the collective intelligence of diverse stakeholders to treat that diversity in knowledge not as an impediment for progress, but rather as an asset to be integrated so that we can kind of move forward with convergence research. And this got me interested in areas related to collective intelligence. Can we harness the collective intelligence of local stakeholders to frame problems, but also provide information about the problem? And can that be integrated with scientific expertise? And so we've got different dimensions related to collective intelligence. We've got cognitions. Now the cognitions can be of course, stakeholders on the ground, policymakers, but also different cognitions from scientists from different fields coming together. They have to, in some way or another, cooperate, spend time together, get a common language, of which, in particular, fuzzy cognitive mapping is very helpful in standardizing knowledge so that it can be integrated together. And I'll show you what that looks like in a little bit. And then coordination. Can we coordinate once we understand the nature of the problem to be able to address it? And what's interesting about this idea about collective intelligence, this phenomena of collective intelligence, is it's been around for a while. And this is just an interesting side note. Sir Francis Galton wrote a paper in 1907 in Nature, where he identified this phenomena, a wisdom of the crowd. And in this particular case, he was at a agricultural fair, and there was a booth and a contest to see who could come closest to guessing the weight of a dead ox. And what Sir Francis Galton did is he collected all individual 1,000 guesses, and he looked at the mean of everyone's responses. And when you looked at the mean of everyone's responses, it came within 1 pound of the actual dead weight of the ox, which is to say that everyone's individual guesses were a little bit incorrect. But when you average the overestimates and the underestimates, you get close to reality, which was a pretty big breakthrough. And so we began thinking, well, if we can do this, there is wisdom in the crowd. If we can do this with the weight of a dead ox, can we do it with other systems? So rather than, when I was a kid, I remember doing this in 4th grade, everyone had to guess in the class the number of jelly beans in the jar. And of course, it turns out that the averaged guess comes the closest, where everybody's individual guess is different. But what if we put fish in that jar? What if we ask environmental stakeholders about the demographics of fish stocks, about recreational fishing pressure, and so on? And it turns out, this is a fun little study, that the wisdom of the crowd, actually, the effect can be found with people working on the ground with reliable results. So I want to talk about, before we go back to talking about how fuzzy cognitive mapping specifically can be used for gene drive research, I want to talk about two exploratory studies to demonstrate the nature of working with stakeholder crowds can better inform the science of complex problems. So can we move beyond point estimates? So we know from previous studies that fishermen are pretty good when you take their average guesses, that they can approximate point estimates. But can crowds also approximate complex systems that are somewhat wise? And what is the role of knowledge diversity in working with stakeholders to improve crowd performance? Who holds important knowledge about the nature of a complex issue? And what are the best kind of mathematical aggregation principles that put that knowledge together to get a model that we can have some kind of confidence in? So this is a paper that came out last year. I think it was looking at the wisdom of stakeholder crowds in complex systems. And of course, we're using it in socio-ecological systems because my background is in fisheries, but the same approach can be used in a range of societal problems, including health problems. So experiment one, so if we, rather than putting jelly beans in a jar or fish in a jar, what if we put an ecosystem in the jar? Can we use collective intelligence to model complex socio-ecological systems? And in this particular case, it's just a case study. We were using lake management of pike in Germany. And I know that sounds very foreign to a lot of you, but recreational fisheries in Germany are privately held resources and are managed by fishing clubs. And these are somewhat bounded systems that we kind of understand pretty well. And so can we harness the wisdom of stakeholder crowds to build an ecosystem models of how these lakes function? So we had a series of recreational fishermen, over 200, develop fuzzy cognitive mapping. And so fuzzy cognitive mapping are just a type of concept map where, for example, water depth here has a positive influence on the fish that are in the water. Stocking the fish has a positive influence. Turbidity of the water has a negative influence, and so on. We gave people these cards and asked them to develop a mental model. So we had all these mental models from different environmental stakeholders. And what we did was we took all of these different models, individually collected, and put them together and looked at the structure of the system to get an idea of what, on average, is their understanding at the highest level of how these ecosystems function, including management measures. Now, as a reference model, we also did the same thing with fishery scientists. So we had 17 fishery scientists, and then we had this crowd of recreational fishermen. Now, the interesting thing about these recreational fishermen is they're different types. Some are just fishermen, some manage the clubs, and some actually manage the water. So there's different forms of expertise in the crowd. And the hypothesis is that the collective intelligence of the crowd of participants could be leveraged in a way so that the crowd's aggregated model more precisely approximated scientist-provided models, both structurally and dynamically. So we're using the expert model from scientific experts as a reference point to see how the crowd does. And so we aggregated it by different stakeholder groups. Different anglers had different knowledge than the club managers. The club managers had slightly different knowledge than the fishery managers. And then, of course, we had the scientist model as the reference point. And it turns out when you look at the structure of the average fishery scientist model and the crowd, that 70% of the strong cause and effect relationships are the same in both models, meaning that the crowd pretty much approximates the major ecosystem dynamics that were found in the expert model. We can look at what's interesting about this, and again, kind of disabuse yourself of thinking about this in fisheries, but different stakeholders, including the 3 different types of anglers, tended to focus on different aspects of the system. Not surprisingly, given people's interactions with the world, they tend to focus on different features of, in this case, the ecosystem. But you can imagine doing this with stakeholders for health problems and looking at nurses versus patients versus political leaders in the area versus ministries of health. They're all going to focus on a different important feature of that system. And when you put their eyes together, when you put all their ideas together, you get a pretty good approximation of how the world works. So anglers focused on certain, so what you can see in the gray is the reference to the expert model. You can see that just regular fishermen focused on different aspects of the system compared to club managers, compared to fishery managers. But what's most interesting is when you take all of their ideas together using these fuzzy cognitive maps, you get a pretty good approximation that matches that higher level expertise. But what is the role of knowledge diversity? How do we harness the collective intelligence across these different stakeholder groups? Because diversity is extremely important for understanding complex problems. We need to moderate diversity. So this is from a paper that came out this year about the diversity bonus and pooling local knowledge about complex problems. And again, these are applied in fisheries, but they could be applied to many, many other contexts that are complex problems. And if we think about, obviously, diversity is being promoted, knowledge diversity as a social imperative these days, but there's a real benefit to incorporating diverse perspective in problem solving. This research has been around for probably 30 years, and it's generally thought that as diversity increases, group performance increases. But I would suggest that there's probably an optimal here, where if it's too diverse, things shut down. And I would imagine if you guys are like me, you've been a part of these interdisciplinary grant proposals or interdisciplinary projects where you have a lot of really good expertise, but maybe there wasn't enough time spent to have a common language of how to address some of these issues. And so ultimately it falls apart. You get a proposal potentially that's this Frankenstein thing that has the genetics up front, the social, the political, and second, and they're not integrated whatsoever. And that's because the diversity is high, the potential is high, but the amount of communication is low, and so it never quite congeals. So in this particular study, so we were able to do it within these freshwater fisheries in Germany, in these somewhat bounded lake systems, but what about a more open system where the boundaries are not quite as clear? And so we moved to ocean fisheries for this study, looking at how climate change might affect the striped bass population in Massachusetts. And the striped bass is a very popular recreational fishery in Massachusetts. And for this, we began to crowdsource models. And whereas in the other study, we gave people the concepts that would comprise their mental model of the lake ecosystem. In this one, we gave them a few building blocks, but we allowed them to integrate or include different aspects of the system that we couldn't have necessarily predicted. And we crowdsourced these online from commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen, fishery managers. So they're all modeling the same system, but from their different perspectives. And we put them together into a crowd model. So we had 3 different models. We had just commercial fishermen as one form of expertise, just recreational guys as another, and fishery manager as another. And then we had their collective ideas put together. This is not important. The details of this are not important, but obviously this shows within different categories, these different stakeholder groups capitalized on their different experiences and their different expertise to comprise the system. So we can look at it like this. So this is basically when you combine all their ideas, this is what they tended to focus on in terms of what they represented. And commercial fishermen tended to represent more biological aspects of the system, whereas recreational fishermen tended to do more social aspects of the system. Obviously, fishery managers were concerned about policy and management, but when you put all of their ideas together, you get a pretty even distribution of the composition that capitalizes and moderates all that different diversity of expertise into one model that we think is pretty good. You can run scenarios on this, and we had different forms of judging the crowd model. We had 7 individual experts who were fishery scientists evaluate in a blinded way each of the 4 models, and they tended almost always, 90% of the time, to choose the crowd model as the best one. So what we're trying to do in terms of fisheries is collaborate with stakeholders to harness their collective intelligence, and different types of stakeholders, not just one, to move from a simple problem to kind of an ecosystem to more complex and open problems that we really don't understand or have boundaries around. And so this idea about collective intelligence has been very helpful in framing how we do this. And we've been developing different methods of understanding different ways in which collective intelligence emerges. And so hopefully we can sidestep collective wisdom, collective ignorance, or suboptimal results, we could get a model that's bad. So we've begun to break down these different approaches to understand the nature of the collective. This is, who do we want to collect expertise from? Who has domain-specific knowledge that needs to be integrated? The nature of the problem, is it a complex problem, or is it something that's more linear, or is it a point estimate? What don't we know? And then the nature of their different methods associated with each one of these, and I'll talk about using fuzzy cognitive math in a second. So this is GeneConvene, right? And you're probably saying, well, why does this guy keep talking about fish? Well, fish, for me, moved from something I still love. I still love fisheries science. I still love fish, still love marine conservation. But I'm just using it as a case study because I know the system pretty well. And so it's just a case study to figure out how can we integrate stakeholder knowledge in more effective ways that have demonstrated positive results in terms of coming up with better model, and it's in terms of worse and decreasing uncertainty. And one of the things that struck me about GeneConvene in particular is this seems to be a red thread throughout a lot of the activities you guys are doing. Convening and facilitating with stakeholders, starting with listening and assessing what the situation is, convening and facilitating, how do you aggregate different forms of knowledge and analyze them, moving to an actual decision at the end. And of course, partnering with stakeholders comes throughout this. This also seemed to be inherent in the values that you guys are drawing upon, looking at consensus building and what are methods in which you can actually build consensus around some of these issues and support stakeholders and be inclusive. And of course, doing this for the public good, where you have a sense of transparency and people have been able to participate in the development of the science and the deployment of some of the science. One of the things that struck me the most was, these 5 questions about GeneConvene, talking about the uncertainties. There are unanswered questions that need to be addressed. The science seems to be there and seems to be pretty solid, but there are questions about how that science and technology is going to interact with lots of things. So not only developing, you have some questions here, but even trying to figure out what are the unknown unknowns. And the idea that many technical safety and policy questions need to be addressed to ensure the development and use of gene drive technologies continue to be explored effectively, responsibly, and ethically. And both of these things seem to be very much in line with a lot of these methods that we've been developing. So a question I have for you guys, as you think about the known unknowns, to see if we can figure out what knowns are unknown that are currently unknown, whose knowledge needs to be integrated into these particular. We know that there are scientists working with gene drive technology, but there are also policymakers, political borders, cultural borders, and of course, how is this going to be uptaken by society when deployed? So I encourage you all, and I'm going to go actually now to mentalmodeler.org. If you just Google mental modeler, you will find the website. You'll go to software, and then you'll click on the online suite. And the main thing that you need to know is the password and username are both mental modeler, one word. And so one of the things as I think about the applications of this past work that we've been doing is how can it be useful for you guys? And one of the things in doing some research about the deployment, about some of the known unknowns, is imagine a situation in which you have 2 different approaches to deployment in a small region. Let's say a small, I don't know what the boundaries, how small it would be, but let's say a small community. And you have 2 different options of population replacement with gene drive or population suppression. And I assume that some of the known risks associated with each one of these is going to be different. And so what I want to do is kind of guide you through a process in which you might use something like Mental Modeler to harness the collective expertise, like in a workshop setting, to figure out, can we share information from each one of our perspectives about how the system operates? And with that, and Hector, do you want to give instructions on the best way in which we can facilitate this conversation? And I'll stop sharing my screen. I'll show you that I'm a real person.
Hi, Stephen. It's good to see you. Yeah, I think what would, contrary to what I said at the beginning of this of the webinar, we will now have the ability to turn on your mic. So the way we do that is for those, we encourage you to raise your hand. Down at the bottom of the screen, there's a raise hand option. So please raise your hand, and then what we'll do is then let you in so you can participate, and we'll have your mic on. So you can do that. Those of you who are listening, go ahead and do that. And
all right, and I will navigate. Yeah, this can be a free form discussion, and we do this often. Now, one thing I'd like to stress is that the models usually built using fuzzy cognitive mapping are most useful for the process of collaboration around a specific boundary object. The model itself may or may not be useful, but it drives a conversation. And so I want to really stress, and this happens for all modeling purposes, the benefit of building a model is often more useful than the model itself in terms of asking what if questions, but they're both useful and they go back and forth, but this should be thought of as more of a learning process. And with that, I'll go ahead and share my screen a little bit, and I won't be able to see you guys, so please just go ahead and
so just anybody can.
Yeah, anybody can. So the way fuzzy cognitive mapping works is, and so I've just come up with a few things as I think about, let's talk about the trade-offs and the known unknowns, potential risks associated with these two. Let's see, I'll highlight them. I'm moving down screen here. Let's assume these two things are the different approaches that you could use: mosquito suppression and mosquito replacement. And what I'm going to do is I'd like you to talk about what other factors positively or negatively affect anything else that happens to be in this system. So I'm going to make an assumption here, and this is certainly not my area of expertise, but let's say as mosquito-borne illnesses increase, it's going to have a negative increase on community health. I think that through disease spread. Now, there are ideas about public acceptance. You know, what are maybe, and with any context, this could be very general, but what are some issues that might accept public acceptance? We might also change this concept to something like political acceptance, because we don't, and that's probably culturally specific. But yeah, anybody can just kind of talk me through how you understand the nature of this problem. What are the other factors that we need to include in this concept map as we kind of build it out? What I'll try to do is capture that and represent it up here as you guys discuss it.
Well, let me just get things started, Stephen. So I guess the thing with regard to public acceptance has to do with the nature of the intervention, and that is that it's a genetically engineered intervention. And so generally what, you know, we'll have to deal with the fact that there's just genetic engineering at this point still has a lot of hesitance. Yeah, you got it right. And so that's one thing that impacts public acceptance.
So I'm going to say as genetically engineered hesitancy increases, it's going to decrease the amount of public acceptance.
Yeah, that would be my.
So that's interesting. So to continue that, and I want to make this model, and again, I'm not sure, but I'm going to say, we can change this in a second, but as public acceptance increases, I would imagine deployment of some of these might increase. If public acceptance increases, the likelihood of adopting these things might increase. And I see David has his hand up.
Yeah, actually, Stephanie, I see your hand up. Why don't you go?
Oh, I was just going to say, probably as the level of illness increases, public acceptance would increase.
As the need, the acuteness of need
Yeah, I'll chime
acceptance
in
of
here.
risk.
There's another
Yeah.
factor here that might put on the model here, which has to do with ecological impacts. I don't know if you want to put that in there as a broad category, but
Absolutely. So let me also connect. So level of illness increases, it's going to decrease community health overall. But yes, so this is something as an armchair ecologist that that works in water, not land. So can you talk a little bit more about the type? We can use the concept ecological impacts, but we don't know what those impacts are. And I'm very curious, as someone who's not studied insects or things that eat insects, what those might be and then the degree to which we can kind of define some of those things and how they might be differentially related to the idea about mosquito replacement versus mosquito suppression. Because I suspect that the anticipated ecological impacts of those two different policies are probably unique.
Right. So I guess the big difference would be, with mosquito suppression, you would have the elimination of a few species, not all of mosquito, but a few species of mosquito. And I guess the overarching question there is, so what would be the effect of that on food webs, for example? Yep. And what might be what might come into the niche that would be left empty by the elimination of a species. There would be other mosquitoes around, but that's a question. As opposed to mosquito replacement, of course, that has where they would stay in place. I think the issue there would be, well, you have a transgene hanging around for potentially a long time. What would be the ecological effects possibly of, a genetically engineered mosquito that might be around? There's just even without any particular ecological problem, there's still a community concern about just foreign DNA hanging around in the population. There are some people who just aren't comfortable with that.
Right. So I have
here
now.
Stephen, there was a question earlier during your talk about the differences between fuzzy cognitive mapping and sign digraphs. Could you make a comparison there?
Yeah, they're very similar. So the difference is this gives you a range of high, medium, or low. So you can begin to using fuzzy set theory to a certain extent, look at degrees of impact and these degrees. So you can imagine a situation where we may have pretty good data in terms of correlations that have a high linear relationship between public acceptance. Let's say we have data on this and mosquito replacement. We can assign a value that's probably more parameterized with statistical information and empirical information. For some of these things, we may not know at all. So we may have to guess, and you can do kind of more of a sensitivity analysis with this. That's much more nuanced than using signed digraphs. However, working with stakeholders, depending on how trained they are. So we're working with heads of household in Nigeria about maternal health. They tend to think of things in just positive or negative, and that's fine. But then you talk to some of the medical doctors that are working in that area, and they have a much more nuanced and can really rank them. So there's more variation in the strengths of the relationships that you define.
Yep, great, thanks.
Other factors that may or may not, and we don't have to do this for Taylor Line, I just want to demonstrate the process of how we might kind of share information, building on the collective expertise that's in this room to have a better idea of the structure of these things.
I noticed some of our colleagues, and I don't want to put anyone on the spot there, but some of our colleagues from Africa are online, and it would be interesting to get their perspective and their viewpoints on what might be given that one of the topics that you've talked about already today is diversity of knowledge, how their particular perspective on this or any other added component might impact on what we're talking about today. Any takers?
Well, Hector, I'm sitting in Maryland, so I'm not in Africa. But,
I agree.
But I mean, we have had experience, in collecting some thoughts on this, and when we've done the problem formulation, and one of the things people talked about was impacts on water quality of this intervention of the GM insects, and so that might be something that could get integrated into this.
Yeah, and that's a particular concern that came up in our problem formulation exercises with African stakeholders.
What was the specific concern about water quality? How did it relate to these other factors?
It was mosquitoes have an aquatic phase, and there was expressed concerns about the GM mosquitoes having some impact on aquatic systems. Sort of captured in this term water quality, but so, probably more from an ecological standpoint in terms of what water quality means. So, also, I see Willie has his hand up too. So Willie, why don't you chime in?
Okay, thanks, Dave. Thanks, Gray, for an excellent presentation. I've been listening to your presentation with keen interest, having been a regulator myself before, the biosafety regulator. And some of these maps that you have shared, like what you're sharing right now, are very important during the decision-making process for GM products. Most countries in Africa and some of the areas in the world, they have adopted Cartagena Protocol. And therefore, these FUSI maps can be very important during stakeholder analysis. And also, when you're trying to establish the processes to take during the decision-making process, like how do you move from research to a regulatory component of the project? How do you involve stakeholders? How do you incorporate policies? And what had captured my interest in this is how do you, because I've learned about the wicked problems that you mentioned. And some of the wicked problems that we have for GM development is the issue of the stakeholders who are not for the technology or the anti-groups. And it will be very important, to look at the entire picture, vis-a-vis how you handle such a groups before you come up with a decision-making process. One interest also that I've seen with this model is that the environmental modelers usually have an issue, when it comes to, like you have identified issues of water quality here. We are best known to involve the environmental impact assessments and strategic impact assessments, and the like. And that model presents a very complicated process, in that many people don't understand the differences when it comes to applying research methodologies to decision-making processes, adopting strategies towards managing risks or identifying risk and all that. So I think a FUSI cognitive process like this may help, if you break down the problems into stages of the development of a product. I think it may be very helpful to help in the entire decision-making process. So I thank you for your attention on that one. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And you bring up, so what's interesting about, as you say, so you could do this, you can take an environmental impact assessment, as I know them, as a document, and turn them into this kind of, would just be an alternative view of that process, or vice versa. You could meet with knowledgeable people within a room, develop a model together, and from that kind of identify the known unknowns and the known risks, and then see what data you have for each one of those risks. One of the interesting things that I remember reading before was also about this idea of genetic spillover, or actually, transboundary. I mean, so there are these boundaries. We have these socio-political boundaries, but mosquitoes don't tend to follow those too much.
Yeah.
Generally, animals don't in general. So, there are also these, potential spillover effects that could be included in this, and how you regulate them, and also how those intersect with existing conservation policies for other transboundary, because I don't know if those regulatory policies that manage, for example, I know in Tanzania and other places, the wildebeest move around, and so they have cooperative agreements, same with fish in Canada, the United States, and so on. But because these are not a sport animal or a commercially valuable animal, do they still have the same type of regulatory frameworks on it? We don't know. I mean, I wouldn't know. But those types of things can also be put in international regulations, let's say.
Yeah.
And those, let's assume, and we would have to define what those are, of course. This is at a broad scale and for the sake of conversation, but let's assume that those actually might have an impact on replacement, where the population actually remains the same, but not necessarily on suppression, where we have a kind of a muted population or a suppressed population, obviously.
Although, I guess the nature of the genetic construct, which is that it's supposed to move, is that the mosquitoes themselves don't necessarily move, but the construct would, and so it could be that before it has its eventual effect of suppressing the population, it could move to another across another political boundary, and that could cause a problem. But I agree. You're right. The replacement versus suppression strategies could present different risks for that happening, just because of the potential longevity of one versus the other.
And I wouldn't know, as not a geneticist, but I wonder what influence it has on genetic diversity in general. Maybe none. I wouldn't know. But we're doing this at the scale of sub-Saharan Africa, so therefore it's not terribly useful because it's not culturally specific. I do want to show you that working with stakeholders, though, you can do some very simple in real time scenario analysis and qualitatively look at what changes. So I just changed this as hesitancy increases, public acceptance is going to decrease, and managing replacement in particular is going to decrease. We can run all sorts of scenarios. Let's talk about hesitancy as in terms of also, so this scenario is investing in gene drive research, but also hesitancy increasing. You can kind of see suppression may go up, mosquito may go up, public acceptance still is down, and water quality, in this case, actually increases a little bit. But we can go back and forth and toggle, just again, to focus on more of the process of developing these together, to have a roadmap of a hypothesized way in which we think the world works that's informed by multiple individuals, to then figure out, well, what are the next research questions we need to ask, or what can we actually gather data on for some sort of proper risk assessment.
Yeah, and I that's very interesting, because we typically, at least so far in terms of the risk assessments for genetically engineered crops, for example, generally go through a process of problem formulation and then sort of a linear description of the pathway to particular harm. But in this case, you could actually have more complex pathways to harm, and interactions between different potential stressors, as they call them, to see how that might affect eventually the harm. And as we get more fine-grained about these steps and you put them into this model, we could actually be able to identify areas that would require more research or more data that would be critical to the eventual outcome.
One of the things we do generally with this type of approach is do kind of what we're doing now, which is this very general model that everybody kind of, we know what the pieces are a little bit, but then you can imagine really focusing in on public acceptance as one particular issue in one specific place, and really building out that small portion of the model and really talking about, well, what are the dynamics of just public acceptance in one space? So zooming much more in a much more detailed way to the dynamics of very specific aspects of these problems, such as, I would imagine, policy issues and the trans-border issues are probably key among those to really look into.
Right. By the way, your fisheries example aren't as off the board as you might think, because we actually also had a fisheries example with Jeffrey Dombacher's talk a couple of weeks ago, and so it's great to knowing what he talked about in terms of his fisheries example and how he used sign diagrams as a way to deal with that modeling with that situation, and then compare it with what you've done here with these fuzzy cognitive maps, and see the similarities and methods, and so it's all coming together. So it's actually a good thing that you did that, because it helps to connect the dots between those two methods.
Hector, I have my hand up. I'm going to jump in.
Okay, sorry.
Stephen, I just wanted to ask if you could say something about, I could see you talked about situations where individuals made these maps, and then you combine them. And would you say something about how the process of combining them, how does that go? How do you do that? Is it really just sort of averaging their responses? Yeah, so maybe just you could say something about getting that.
As a rule of thumb, yes, it's basically averaging them. But and this is a much deeper kind of basic science question: is who has expertise about a system like this? You can kind of identify stakeholder groups by profession as one way of clustering people. But you have to moderate the diversity between each one of those groups. So you just have commercial fishermen as one group, you average them first, then you average recreational fishermen, then you average, politicians or whoever it happens to be. Then you take the average of the average. And what that does is it gives you a more parsimonious model where you reduce a lot of the noise. We've done this with cancer researchers, for example, including geneticists, oncologists, public health people. And you have to moderate by type of expertise, which means you have to decide who has expertise about what aspects of the system, but then get a model that's more parsimonious and useful for decision making. It is not 400 nodes going everywhere, where it's a very difficult process. But the short of it is, if you get, I think the best approach and most efficient approach, and what we're doing in parts of Nigeria, is having focus group with different stakeholder groups. So we're having just kind of heads of households as it relates to maternal health, pregnant mothers, doctors, birth attendants. And so eventually we'll have 5 different models, but they're all collaboratively built within each stakeholder group. And then we'll take the averaging of all those stakeholder groups.
Stephen, I just wanted to make sure we captured some of the questions that are now in the chat. I think the question that Willie has is one that he already asked when we gave him the floor to talk, but he does ask some of the challenges in deploying GM products or anti-GM stakeholder groups and integrating these into this model. I think, Willie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we already addressed that. Is that correct?
Yes, correct, Hector.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to make sure we didn't. So the next question that we have on the chat is, do you have any experiences using these approaches with indigenous peoples? Ensuring that indigenous peoples and local community knowledge is incorporated is an important goal, particularly, especially as things are progressing with the Cartagena Protocol. This is a very important group.
Yes, so we do, but of course, indigenous people come in lots of different ways. They're heterogeneous groups. So In some of the Canadian fisheries that we worked in, we've talked to tribal leaders there. What's interesting about some indigenous groups, so what this does is it allows, you can imagine doing like a power analysis, assuming that whoever is in charge and has power within a decision-making context, their knowledge is probably forefronted at the expense of other people's knowledge, right? So, and that's generally how decision-making works. So you can imagine a situation where you capture you could say marginalized, but like indigenous people whose knowledge is not typically, or has not historically, I should say, been incorporated into decision making. You can highlight their knowledge at the same level as other decision maker knowledge to look at how it differs and then kind of integrate it. So we have done that. Interestingly, working with tribal groups in Canada, you know, a lot of the people that are involved in fisheries from the indigenous people there, their knowledge comes from the tradition, you know, culturally passed down knowledge, but they're also reading scientific papers and interacting with local ecological knowledge. So it's an amalgamation of all these things. So one of the things that this does is it allows for that full kind of nuance and spectrum of knowledge, because my knowledge is built on multiple pieces, not just because I'm a scientist or whatever it happens to be. And you can look at variation and really capture the fact that, you know, a lot of people's information or knowledge that they hold in their head comes from a lot of different sources. It's not just like one scientific knowledge or just, you know, local ecological knowledge, but there's a lot more nuance. And for a long time in the literature, they kind of just said traditional or indigenous and then scientific and compared all of those. But there's a lot more fluidity between those, especially as we all become more interconnected.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me just double check to make sure that we have all the questions in the chat taken care of. Yeah. So, well, I must say this has been a really, a really interesting talk, and I'm sure that we'll be talking a lot more about this as we go on, because as you might have seen, and as Willie Tanui mentioned, this is really a tool that I think could be very well used in not only in engagement, but just helping regulators and decision makers in his part of the world just help to conceptualize the problems, but also conceptualize the potential solutions, and then help to make decisions. And so, yeah, this is, I'm glad we were able to bring this forward and make people aware of this, and hopefully we'll be following through on this some more by helping to bring this tool and give more experience with this and other types of models to conceptualize complex problems to the folks that we work with, particularly on the African continent. So with that, I think I'm going to just I'm just going to say thanks, Stephen, and just mention to people that the next talk, which is scheduled for December 1st, is going to, we're still planning on that. We did have someone lined up to give the talk on Bayesian networks, but unfortunately for personal reasons, he had to cancel. But we are going to try to bring someone else in, and hopefully we'll be able to do that. So watch this space, and you will be able to see how these the fuzzy cognitive maps, and then before that, sign diagraphs really fit into this continuum of tools that can be used for looking at these kinds of problems. So as I said, watch this space. Thank you, Stephen, for a very stimulating talk, and we'll be in touch. Definitely be in touch.